All right, we're in. We're going to spend more of our time this time in chapter 5 in Chad Ramsey's discussion on church benevolence. And this is one I think I'd mentioned to you before that last week that I really kind of struggled getting my arms around some of the things you were saying, and I think I've got a better handle on it today, and hopefully that'll help us. I wanted to talk about last week. Um, the basics of why we do what we do and why we believe what we believe, because I think a lot of the issues that he gets into in his section stem from just some missed points that he has on just the basic fundamental ideas that we're dealing with and the pattern that we see. I've mentioned this every time. All these writers have all agreed there's a pattern that we ought to be following. The question is, what pattern is it? And what it looks like to me is that Brother Ramsey makes some arguments in this that consistently ignore the actual pattern that we see. In fact, he kind of rewrites it a few times. And it's kind of subtle. It's one of those things where I think sometimes you really have to turn it around in your mind to figure it out. They got me thinking, and I think this is worth saying. It's going to sound like in some of these discussions, particularly today and next week, if we continue on this, why are we quibbling over these details? Why does it matter? There's some distinctions that we're going to make that seem in and of themselves to be, I think, a little nitpicky in our mind. And it's easy for us to kind of start thinking about, well, look, does any of this stuff really matter? We're quibbling about details. And the answer is that it does matter, because you start to see in his arguments the building blocks for a lot of other things. That if this works, then why not this work? And why not this? And we keep going and going and going until all of a sudden we look up and the Lord's church is not recognizable anymore, because it's no longer following the pattern really in any way. And so we have to have those conversations at the beginning, and we have to be precise about how we speak about things, because if we don't, you know, where we end up going off in all kinds of different directions. And so, if you remember, we talked about just real quickly. We talked about last time just the pattern of benevolence, and we won't go through these obviously again, but how every single time we look at this discussion, we see a collective action that is taking place. We're going to talk more about 2 Corinthians 9 today, because this is one of the passages that comes up a lot in this discussion. And we talked about the idea of the distinction between the collective action and the individual action. And this kind of where we're going into today, because Brother Ramsey's argument really stems on this idea that if you have a command that is given to an individual, then it has to be a collective command as well. In other words, if you are told to do something or act in a certain way or live in a certain way, then not only is it a command to you, but it's also a command to the church collectively to do those things. And maybe I'm sure you've heard that argument. What the individual can do, the church can do. And there's some issues with that. And I want to start with some points he makes in 2 Corinthians 9, because this is kind of I think the passage that a lot of times the argument starts. We alluded to this, but let's go over and look at it. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And we'll go towards the end of the chapter. We've talked about this before, so I'm not going to go rehash the fact that the repetitive nature of the phrase "for the saints" is used over and over in this. There's no real serious debate that the collection in 1 Corinthians 16 and 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 and Romans 15 is talking about church collecting from churches to create a fund that will be used to support and help needy saints in Jerusalem. The dispute comes when we get into a passage down later on. If you go in in verse 12, where he says, "For the ministry of this service," in other words, the distribution to the saints, "is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God upon you." And I suspect you probably, it's interesting in page 141, he makes this observation. He says in that last paragraph that the issue is the meaning of all men at the conclusion of verse 13. Is Paul saying that the contribution sent to Jerusalem by the Corinthians was used first to help the saints in that location and then sent on by the congregation at Jerusalem to help saints in other locations? Or is he saying the Christians in Jerusalem applied the resources first to the saints who were suffering in that location and then to non-saints? He says, obviously, the way one answers this question has serious ramifications on the entire discussion. Now, what's interesting to me about this, if you read through this, you may have noticed this. He never answers this question. He never actually deals with which answer should be given for this passage. He just kind of assumes it and moves on. But there's something that you're going to notice, and the more I see this, the more I notice it. When people want to do what they want to do in the Bible, they will go to a passage and they will give you a binary choice. It either means this or it means that. It's either saying that there was one work that led to works in other areas because they had more money than they needed, or it was one work that led to assisting to non-saints because all the saints had been helped. As you're thinking about this, and granted, I've probably had more time to think about this than y'all have, but can you think of a possible third option of this, Laura? What? Okay. Okay. Yeah. It doesn't have to be confined to this time, this specific time, right? Um, Anything else? How about this? Do you think it's possible or conceivable that the Corinthian church had developed a reputation for helping the saints? Does that seem reasonable? When they talk about he makes the assumption that your generosity of your contribution for them and for all others is talking about the same contribution or the same spirit. For example, if you look at or in Colossians 1, for example, Colossians 1 verse 4, where Paul is talking about the faith of the Colossians, when he says, "Since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love that you have for all the saints." In other words, we heard about I don't know, but I know that you've been doing this not just to me. We don't know each other, but I know you've been doing it to other people. 1 Thessalonians 1:7, where he's talking about the Thessalonians and their faith and the work they're doing. And he says that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 7. So what's he saying there? He's saying that you have a reputation for doing this kind of thing. I don't have to tell people how zealous you are for the word because everybody knows it. It seems to me that that's a more likely explanation of what's going on in 2 Corinthians 9. That we know that you've done this for us. We also know that you've done it for other people, and we glorify God that there are churches and Christians such as you that are dedicated to helping the Lord's people wherever they are. To me, that seems like a pretty reasonable assumption for what's going on here. But that kind of gets left off the discussion because maybe he just didn't. I'll be charitable. Maybe he just didn't think of that. Maybe that's just not something. When we go into the scriptures, looking at it from a certain context, it's very easy to kind of make our view so narrow that we just assume it's got to be this or this. Well, actually, there's some other things that it could be too. And that's probably a lesson for us as well, and for me specifically, that we have to be very careful about how honest we're being with our interpretation. We talk about a necessary inference. We talked about that earlier when we were talking about authority. What is a necessary inference? What's an example of a necessary inference? And it doesn't have to be biblical, just anything. Okay, place to meet. We got to have a place to meet. If we're called to assemble, we got to assemble somewhere, right? So the need for that assembly is going to depend on what? There's a couple of different things, probably, right? Yeah. I mean, you talking about? Yeah. We could say, well, we have examples for the churches meeting in houses. Well, it might not be a great example for us because we probably could do that. But some other places where we've been, meeting in houses just isn't going to work to bring the whole assembly together. And if we're called to bring the entire church together, obviously we've got to have a way to do that. So that's a necessary inference that has to take place, Laura. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Can we effectively do God's word in the middle of a in the middle of a rainstorm or whatever it might be? We have to have an option for that. But we have the meeting in the school of Tyrannus, we have the meeting in the temple, we have the meeting in houses. There's just a lot of different examples, and I, I, I think I mentioned the other day that the pattern becomes stronger the more times it's repeated, right? But when you start seeing a general principle playing out in multiple different ways, I think it kind of goes in the other direction, doesn't it? All of a sudden, it starts to realize that maybe the specific way that they did this wasn't really the point, because they did it this way, they did it that way, they did it this way, but they were all accomplishing the same thing, which they were assembling to. And so that idea of a necessary inference is that we really can't do this if we don't accept this. uh, I would argue, Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. What's the necessary inference in that about baptism? Because he doesn't say he that believeth not and is not baptized. Did he need to? I don't think he did. I've heard people make that argument. But to me, it's a pretty necessary inference that if he says these two things are required for salvation, then I can't go and say, well, okay, I'll just take one of those out. That's not how it works. Because because he didn't say in the negative. That's not how that works. There's a necessary inference that's involved, but it has to be necessary. And what I think you see in Brother Ramsey's arguments is a lot of unnecessary inferences that are made. So it's important for us to always be willing to think through some of these things and understand exactly what's going on here. So and as you go and think about his first point here in First and Second Corinthians 9, it goes back to what we said about the pattern. At some point, I've got to either be able to show an example that this is what this passage means, or I've got to be able to show in the context that all men needs to mean all men in a universal standpoint. Does that make sense? And there's nothing in the passage that indicates that. There's no discussion of non-Christians anywhere in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. It continually refers to the support of the saints. It just keeps going back and using that language over and over and over again. I have to inject the idea in to get it to work. And the reason that he does that, and typically as I was thinking about this and going through the argument that he will make, and most other institutional groups will make, is that the reason that we can assume all men here means all people and not just Christians is based on really two verses. And the first one is in Galatians 6, and we've looked at this passage before. If you remember in Galatians 6, let's see, it is in verse 10, where it says, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." Now, would any of us argue that do good to all is not referring to all people everywhere? Would we agree that verse 10 is saying we need to do good to everybody, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not? Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. I don't think we would get any argument, and he accepts that as well. He says the only question really is this a collective command or an individual command? And his argument, in large part, if in fact, he says it on page 142. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, in the beginning of the second paragraph, I'll just read what he says. He says, "Given the straightforward nature of this statement, there is little doubt that benevolence should be extended to non-saints, as we would all agree. In support of the congregational fulfillment of the admonition, consider the following contextual matters. The letter was written to the churches of Galatia. Brethren, plural, are being addressed in verse 1 of chapter 6. Paul speaks of the Galatians collectively and uses the term us. Okay. He mentions how he wrote this letter to you, plural. He says, additionally, it's worth noting that in the same context, Paul issues the following instructions to the Galatians. Let him who taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. If the admonition in Galatians 6:10 is to do good to all, it can only be fulfilled individually and not congregationally. One is left to wonder whether providing support to gospel preachers must also be done individually. It's hard to imagine the Galatian Christians making a distinction between individual and congregational assignments when reading Paul's letter. Let's see, I'll stop there for a second. No, I will keep going. I'm sorry. He says, this is especially true when one considers the letter was sent to the congregations and not individuals. I'll talk about that in a second. Regarding this, Thomas Warren observed, those churches were going to assume that everything in that letter which authorized actions would authorize church actions, which, by the way, according to a lot of commentaries that are not churches of Christ, is not true. But anyway, unless there was some reason such would be impossible. Now, you notice something, and again, it keeps going back to this idea. He says, is it impossible for the collective group to do this individual command? Well, he leaves out one other option again, which is maybe it's unauthorized. They could do it, but is it authorized? And the assumption then is that if we don't see anything about that in this passage, then we're going to take this passage in itself, in an isolation, and assume that that means that if it's possible for the church to do it collectively, then that must mean that it's authorized. Let's look at what he says here. First of all, he makes the argument that, well, let's start with the support of the gospel. He brings up verse 6. Let him who is taught in the word share in all good things with him. His argument then is, if do good to all is only an individual command, then that means that supporting a gospel preacher must also be only an individual command. In other words, the only way that I could earn a living is each one of you individually were to give me a check, not through the church, but through individually. Now, can you see a problem with his logic? Where do I get my authority as a gospel preacher to earn a living by the gospel? Surely there must be somewhere else that I can go. Anybody remember where it is? Sorry? Okay. 2 Corinthians 11:8. Yeah, he talks about the fact that he's receiving support from other churches. And by the way, uses it collectively. The church collectively is supporting me. So again, if I just look at Galatians 6 in a vacuum, well, there you go. There's only way that we can support, only way that I can encourage a gospel preacher, only way I can support him is individually. Well, is it, if you look at Galatians 6 and what he says here, is there an individual obligation and I'm not trying to tell you this so you'll do things for me, but is there an individual obligation between the one who's being taught and the one who is teaching? I mean, that's what he says, right? Isn't that what he says? Let him who is taught in the word share in all good things with him who teaches. There is a bond that is there, right? Now, but what does that mean? The assumption that he makes is that must be money. Is there any way you can possibly think of for you to support or encourage or help a gospel preacher that doesn't involve writing him a check? Think we could do that? Encouragement, spiritual blessings, hospitality. There's any number of things that you could do that don't have anything to do with salary. And so I would argue that even if he is saying, which I think he probably is, the point that he's trying to make is that there needs to be a relationship between the one who's being taught and the one who's teaching. And again, I'm not saying this to say you need to bake me a pie or something like that. That's not the point. Laura can do that. But the point is that there needs to be a fellowship there. There needs to be a relationship there. Whatever that looks like. And Paul doesn't say what that looks like. But as we said, he doesn't have to be talking about pay or salary, because we can go to 2 Corinthians 8, was 2 Corinthians 11. I would also go to 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul makes the full argument. You know, when he says, do we not have the right to eat and drink? He tells the Corinthians there, and he goes through and asks the questions and makes the scriptural argument for why a gospel preacher can make a living preaching the gospel. He says in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 9, Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Does not do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads on the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? He goes on then to say, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not even we more also? So down in verse 14, he says, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. There it is. I mean, it's pretty simple. And so the idea again, it's this strategy of taking this passage and isolating and assuming that must be where you're getting your authority. Well, if that's the case, then you each just have to start writing individual checks to the preacher. That's not what we see, because we see patterns that tell us that that's not the case. And again, that's a good example of why we have to be willing to look at these things, not just from the standpoint of this one passage, but we have to look at everything else we know. And everything that Paul's going to write is always going to be in the context of what has already been authorized and what the work of the church truly is. Now, he makes the argument, and this is the next thing I want to look at, which is that since the church is written to a group, then all the commandments must be group commandments. Does that make sense? He says, okay, so it's addressed brethren. He used the word us or we or you, plural. He's talking to a group of people, and if you're writing to a group of people, his argument is that all the commands have to be applied collectively to a group. Now, can you think of any examples where that might not be true? Yeah, 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 yeah. Larry, go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of individual commands that are written, but they're written, it's somebody made this great point that why does Paul write a letter, for example, in or Ephesians, and he gives instructions to the wives and he gives instructions to the husband? Why would he do that in a letter that's written to husbands and wives? Is it important for me to see the commands given to a wife? Is it important for the wife to see the commands given to the husband? Yes, absolutely it is. We need to understand all of that. That doesn't mean that the commandment that's given to her also applies to me or also applies collectively to the group. They're individual commands. And I think it's pretty easy when we think about how we are called to live. When Paul writes, for example, Ephesians 4, when he talks about the kind of people you ought to be, he says in verse 1 of Ephesians 4, I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you, plural, to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in a bond of peace. Is that a collective or an individual work? Is the work of maintaining peace in the local church, is that a collective or an individual work? Yes, I think it's both, isn't it? And I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit. He makes the argument, and this is a true point, that there are certain commands that can have a collective and an individual component as well. And that's absolutely true. And I think this, but there's a distinction. Because what is the role of the individual, for example, in seeking peace in the local congregation? What do I do? What's my role in that? Making sure that we have a peaceful congregation. Okay. Yeah. 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 I need to be doing my best to do what I need to do. Can I do that for you? No. I can't change your behavior. You can't change my behavior. That is an individual action. There's no collectivity going on. What's the collective responsibility of that? Unity that it forms? What happens when there isn't peace? What happens when there's not peace? When two individuals can't get along? What's the church's role in that? Yeah, we have no really. Does the church have a responsibility in that? I would argue that it does. The point is we're coming together trying to do this. And if there's an individual or individuals that are making that a problem, the church has to find a way to collectively act and deal with that. That is a collective responsibility of the church. But again, that's not the same. That's not my responsibility. I don't have the right if I know there are two brethren that aren't getting along, I don't have the right to go inject myself into their business and say you two need to get it squared away. That's not my. That's not the way that that's supposed to be handled. And so there's a different responsibility, even though the command is given to both the individual and the collective. Larry. Yeah. 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 That's right. I'm going to talk more about that. So hold on to that thought because that is, I think, one of the greatest examples of how we can look at this idea of a collective command and an individual command. It's the same command, but there's different ways in which it's applied. And I think that's an important point here. I think I'm ready to go. Yeah, let's talk about that now. All right. So you mentioned this. Do we eat individually or collectively? Literally, you know we eat together, right? What makes the fact that we're eating and drinking the Lord's Supper a collective action? Yeah, we're doing it together as a church. We've all agreed to come together at the same time, and we agreed to do it together. To your point, that's the collective command. But I can't eat it for you, and you can't eat it for me. Each of us individually we don't collectively eat. I mean, I guess there's a metaphorical way that you could argue that, but at the end of the day, I eat, you eat. It's a thing that we are called individually to do. And as Larry pointed out, we're called individually to examine ourselves. I can't do that for you. You can't do that for me. Go ahead. Mm. Yeah, 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 yeah. I got you, and I won't go down that road either because it's yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so when we think about, and that's exactly right. And if you think about the collective command, and in fact, let's look at here. Let's turn over 1 Corinthians 11. Let's just read this because I think there's some pretty clear distinctions between the individual responsibility and the collective responsibility in this discussion. Because he says, in the following instruction, I do not command you, again, plural, you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. He goes on. Let's just keep going. Let's go down to verse 23. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Stop there for a second. The individual command is pretty obvious, right? Each of us eat the bread, we drink the cup. What's the collective action? What's the purpose of this? Why do we come together to do this? What does he say at the end of this passage? What does verse 26 say? Claim the Lord's death until he comes. Is that a collective action? Absolutely it is. because that's the statement we are publicly making. When we come together to take the Lord's Supper, we together are saying that. That's why when people ask, "But can a non-Christian take the Lord's Supper?" Well, they can eat it, but they're not participating in it, because this is not just a memorial. This is a statement of faith that we make every time we do this. That's something we do collectively. And of course, individually, each of us have a responsibility to make sure that that's why we're doing it. And he goes on and talks about the idea of examining yourself in verse 28. Uh, that's why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died, because some of you aren't doing this the way it ought to be done. Is okay. There's an individual command again, an individual judgment. But then he says, "So if my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another." Is that a collective action or an individual action? Yeah. That's probably a tricky way because the way it's worded, right? We are. It's a collective thing. And, well, I guess maybe the best way to answer that is, if all but one of us hold off until the other person shows up, have we waited? Not really, because it's a collective thing. The command to wait for one another is something that you as a group, this is how you need to resolve to do this. It's something we agree to do together. So there's a collective action there again that governs our individual actions. And I think that's one of the things that, again, I don't think it's that complicated. And I was trying to think of some good examples of this. And the one that I kept thinking of is, if you remember, you were in, let's say you were in a fire drill or something like that back in school. And teacher stands up and says, "All right, everybody get your books and follow me." Is that an individual command or a collective command? Okay, everybody means everybody. It's collective. The whole group is to do this. Where's the individual aspect of that? Yeah, you got to grab your own books. He's not saying that, well, also grab his books and no, you grab yours. That's what your responsibility is. But we're all doing the same thing. We're all doing our part to bring it about. I think we can understand that pretty simply. That I can give a command to a group that has individual and group components that don't necessarily have to be the same thing. So in other words, and so let's go back to Galatians 6. Do good to all, especially to those of the household of faith. If that is a group command, I still have to look at the other aspects of Scripture that say, okay, how is the group supposed to do this? Are there any restrictions that you can think of from an individual standpoint into how I can do good? I don't know of any, as long as it's good. David, you look like you might have had one there. Yeah, you got to define it what God's good is, right? You can't just say, "I think this would be good, therefore I'm going to go do it." But collectively, do we have restrictions? I think we do. And I think the pattern bears that out. I think the continued commands and the examples that we see have given us preponderance of evidence that every other place in Scripture that we see, we're talking about a limited benevolence that means that the church is not built and created to be a world help organization. It's just not. And he makes the point earlier on, I'm about out of time, and I'm going to probably come back and talk about this, but he makes the point that there are three basic organizations. Let's see, where is it? He says this. It's down in, it's down in 135. He says that God has ordained three institutions to exist and function on the earth: the home, the government, and the church. Is that a fair statement? I think it is. I can't think of a fourth. Now, he does what he's been doing throughout this article, and he leaves out another option there, which is also the individual. He said that there's three options, and essentially, it almost seems to be that one or the other of these three has to be tasked with this particular thing. Again, it's an assumption that he's going to make, but it's not necessarily a good assumption. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week when we get into that part of it. Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to bring up? So if you look at Galatians 6, for example, we'll close with Galatians 6 and look at what is being discussed. I think he makes the argument that it must be talking about groups because he uses we and us and all these other plural verbs. And I think hopefully we've dealt with that argument. But if you look at how many things are dealing with individual in Galatians 6, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgressions, you who are spiritual should restore him in spirit of gentleness. Is that a collective or an individual command? Who's tasked with this job? Yeah. spiritual people, the individuals. Keep watch for yourself, me, lest you too be tempted. In other words, there's an individual concept going on. Bear one another's burdens, so fulfill the law of Christ. Is there a time for the collective bearing of burdens? Yeah, there is. But how effective is bearing somebody's burdens if, for example, let's say we were going, somebody had a death in the family, and the church, somebody got up and announced, we're going to pray for this individual because we want to make sure to remember them. And okay, the church is going to pray for you. That's great. Nobody says a word about it to them afterwards. Nobody offers to help. Nobody says, hey, what can I do for you? I'm thinking about you. I'm praying. There's no individual component of this whatsoever. Is that going to work? I don't think it does. And so there's clearly this idea that the individual action and the individual responsibility is what drives all this. And what you start to see in Brother Ramsey's argument is that the collective is what drives all of it. And in fact, and again, we'll talk about this next week. I know I'm out of time. That when you start putting, for example, the question of the orphanage and other examples, and get somebody a choice. All right, we're going to help because we are authorized to help the widows and the orphans. We can do two. You can go do it on your own, but we can do it collectively through the church. Which one am I going to take with you? Helping through the church is just a lot easier. You almost effectively remove that option by the choice that you have set up. So anyway, we'll talk about more, Lord willing, next week. So anyway, thank you for your attention. We're out of time, so we'll pick up there next week. Thank you.